On the night of May 18th, 1994, a young woman full of life, with a vibrant spirit and the joy typical of her age, bid a warm farewell to her friends and fellow revelers at a popular nightclub in the city of Orlando. Absolutely no one present at that place, not even herself, could have imagined that this cheerful goodbye would be the last time her loved ones would have the privilege of seeing her radiant smile, the light that emanated from her eyes, her overflowing vitality. Tragically, the dawn of the following day would reveal a horrifying scene. Her body, the victim of a brutal assault, was discovered in a desolate area, abandoned as if it were an object devoid of any sentimental or human value. The perpetrator of such an atrocious act, identified as Thomas Lee Gudinas, would face justice and after a lengthy legal process would be sentenced to capital punishment, scheduled for execution more than 3 decades after that fateful day. However, despite the relentless passage of time and the imminence of the execution, a disturbing question persists in the minds of many. What dark abyss resides in the soul of a human being capable of snatching a life with such ferocity and contempt? And beyond the simple sentence, what twisted motivations or internal demons can drive someone to commit such an irreparable and deeply painful act of barbarity? Orlando, Florida, in the vibrant spring of 1994, the city appeared as a melting pot of contrasts, a strange and at times disturbing amalgam of dazzling magic and a palpable undercurrent of chaos. On one side stood the majestic theme parks, true magnets attracting crowds of tourists from all corners of the world, eager to immerse themselves in a universe of fantasy and limitless fun. On the other side, a parallel reality existed, a shadowy facet made up of marginalized and forgotten neighborhoods, a labyrinth of dangerous streets full of uncertainty, carefully hidden from the eyes of visitors behind the illusory veil of Disney's magical kingdom. In this context, Michelle McGrath, a young woman of just 22 years old, was at the peak of her life. That night, she had decided to meet up with a group of friends at the bustling nightclub Big Daddy's, a venue particularly popular among local youth, known for its festive atmosphere and contagious music. It was just an ordinary Wednesday on the calendar, but in that time of year, with the warm weather and youthful energy bubbling, any night of the week could easily turn into an extension of Saturday night. Michelle was an outgoing and sociable person with a contagious sense of humor and an innate kindness that made her stand out in any social gathering. That particular night, she hadn't consumed large amounts of alcohol. Her intention was simply to enjoy the music, let herself go with the rhythm of the dance, and return home safe and sound at the end of the evening. However, fate, relentless and capricious, had other plans for her. Her desire for a night of uncomplicated fun would never come true. She never made it home. Around 3 a.m., as the party began to wind down and the club slowly emptied out, Michelle made a fatal decision. She stepped alone into the cold, dark night. The parking lot, once a bustling sea of lights and motion, was now a half-lit graveyard of metal. Did she know as she walked to her car that each step brought her closer to darkness? Did she even feel a chill, a premonition of the horror awaiting her in the shadows? It was there, in that silent and treacherous hour, where it is believed she crossed paths with a predator, a man named Thomas Lee Gudinas, a man who, in a matter of moments, would steal much more than her purse or her car. He would steal her future, her smile, her very life. But what circumstances led her to that encounter? Was it mere coincidence or a predestined chain of events? And most importantly, could it have been prevented? When examining the psychological profile of Thomas Lee Gudinas, a disturbing conclusion emerges: the presence of deep emotional dissociation. Far from being an impulsive subject driven by momentary outbursts of anger, we are faced with an individual capable of exercising significant control over his emotions, concealing latent rage beneath a superficial appearance of normalcy. His modus operandi suggests methodical planning, a silent and calculated action, characteristics that, in the field of criminology, are indicative of an individual with an extremely high potential for dangerousness. But what are the factors that contributed to the formation of this profile? What psychological mechanisms allowed him to dissociate his actions from their consequences? And fundamentally, what lessons can we draw from this case to identify and prevent similar behaviors in the future? The answer to these questions is crucial to understanding the nature of evil and strengthening our capacity to protect society from its most extreme manifestations. Thomas Lee Gudinas, a young man of barely 20 years at the time, was already familiar with the bitter taste of the law. His police record, although not particularly extensive, revealed a worrying pattern of behavior: petty thefts, illegal possession of weapons, altercations, and occasional assaults. What drove this young man down the path of crime? What deficiencies or frustrations led him to defy social norms? He dropped out of school at an early age, leaving behind any vestige of a conventional life. His existence unfolded between the desolate walls of cheap motels, sporadic jobs that barely allowed him to survive, and a marginal environment where hopelessness seemed to be the only constant. Those who knew him, or thought they did not describe him as inherently violent. But neither did they consider him someone trustworthy, someone to entrust with secrets or personal safety. What secrets did Gudinas hide behind that facade of normality? What repressed impulses turned him into a ticking time bomb? But what truly chills the blood, what transforms this case into a harrowing reminder of the fragility of life, is one chilling detail. Just a few hours before the brutal murder of Michelle McGrath, another woman, gripped by panic, had reported to the police an attempted abduction. A man matching Gudinas's physical description alarmingly well had approached her at gunpoint. Fortunately, that woman managed to escape from the clutches of her attacker, saving herself from a tragic fate. Was it mere coincidence? Or did Providence grant her a second chance? Michelle, unfortunately, was not so lucky. Fate, relentless and silent, had placed her in the sights of a predator. Could she have done something differently? Was there some warning sign that went unnoticed? And above all, how can we ensure that no other innocent young woman falls victim to the darkness lurking in the shadows? The relentless light of dawn on May 19th revealed a scene that would chill the blood of any human being with a shred of empathy. In a grim and desolate alley located behind a school, a place that should be synonymous with innocence and learning, lay the lifeless body of Michelle McGrath. What twisted design of fate had led her to that place of horror? What kind of monster could desecrate a space consecrated to the future with such an act of barbarity? Her body, half naked and vulnerable, told a story of unspeakable terror. The signs of sexual violence were evident, a brutal affront to her dignity as a woman and as a human being. But the most heartbreaking detail was the evidence of severe cranial trauma, inflicted with a savagery that defied all logic and comprehension. What kind of fury, what kind of hatred could drive someone to unleash such cruelty on a defenseless young woman? The autopsy would later reveal that Michelle had been brutally beaten with a blunt object, possibly a metal flashlight, turned into a lethal weapon in her attacker's hands. Every blow, every fracture was a silent testimony of her suffering, a muffled scream in the darkness. Did she feel pain? Did she have time to understand what was happening? And most terrible of all, did she die knowing that her life, full of promises and dreams, had been cut short in the cruelest and most unjust way? Investigators described the scene as heartbreaking. There were no direct witnesses, but a broken shoe with traces of blood was found nearby. And most importantly, DNA under Michelle's fingernails. She fought back. Until the very last second, she fought to live. The biological clock of justice, often slow and tedious, in the case of Gudinas, moved with unusual speed, propelled by the harrowing testimony of a witness who had miraculously escaped the clutches of death. The woman, who had fled just hours before the atrocious crime, still carried the terror etched into her pupils and the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She did not hesitate. Her memory, vivid from the trauma, reconstructed the face of her attacker, the silhouette of the man who had dragged her to the edge of the abyss. And that silhouette, that face, belonged to Gudinas. Her identification was a key piece, the missing link police needed to turn suspicion into an arrest warrant. The police machinery, which had been working non-stop, sprang into action with renewed vigor. Officers, with Gudinas' image burned into their minds and the urgency to stop a predator, hunted him without rest. Days later, the net closed in. Gudinas' luck, or perhaps his carelessness, led him to a predictable end. He was found sleeping, curled up in the precarious shelter of an abandoned car. A pathetic scene for a man accused of such horrors. The image clashed brutally with the violence of his alleged crimes. A sleeping lion, but with blood-stained claws. The arrest was swift, almost without resistance. But what the police found in his possession would cement the accusations even further. A metal flashlight. It wasn't just any flashlight. Its weight and shape matched the kind of object that could have been used in a brutal attack. And then, the most chilling detail. On his clothes, among the folds of the fabric, investigators found small traces of blood. Subsequent analysis was merciless. The blood wasn't his. It matched, unequivocally, the blood of the victim. Forensic evidence began to weave an inescapable web around Gudinas. But the most disturbing proof, the one that etched an indelible image into the minds of investigators and resonated in every heart that heard the story, wasn't physical. It was silence. During the interrogation, in the cold and sterile room of the police station, a reaction was expected. Tears of remorse, cries of innocence, pleas for help or mercy. Desperation, fury, fear. But Gudinas did not cry. He did not shout. He did not ask for help. He simply remained silent. It was a dense silence, heavy, unnatural. A silence that was not shock or confusion, but an unsettling calm. A void that did not proclaim innocence, but in some way screamed guilt. His gaze, empty, or perhaps too full of something no one could decipher, left an indelible mark. Was it the coldness of a sociopath, the total disconnection of a monster, or the terror of someone who knew his fate was sealed? That silence, more than any word, became the most eloquent testimony of his enigmatic psyche, a hook for anyone who tried to understand the darkness that inhabited him. Sometimes silence can be more disturbing than a scream, and Thomas Lee Gudinas knew that very well. The trial against Gudinas began in 1996. Although it didn't make national headlines nor become a high-profile media spectacle, in Florida, the case resonated with an unsettling intensity. The community followed it closely, with a mixture of morbid curiosity and a thirst for justice, as the details of the atrocious crime began to unfold in the cold courtroom. The air vibrated with tension, the pain of the victims, and the solemnity of a process that would decide the fate of a man. The prosecution, aware of the weight of the evidence, deployed a powerful arsenal. Every piece of the puzzle they had assembled pointed unrelentingly toward Gudinas. They presented irrefutable DNA evidence, the silent testimony of science that directly linked the accused to the crime scene and the victim. They displayed personal items found in Gudinas's possession that belonged to the assaulted woman, each one a tiny piece of proof of his connection to the horror. And of course, the traces of blood that matched the victims, a mute testament to the violence inflicted, a biological imprint that screamed his presence. The prosecutors painted a terrifying picture of a calculating predator, whose actions left no room for doubt about his guilt. Their presentation was meticulous, cold, and, for the jury, overwhelming. How could such overwhelming evidence be refuted? However, Gudinas's defense attorney, faced with a wall of solid evidence, attempted a desperate strategy, arguing that his client suffered from undiagnosed mental disorders. It was an attempt to humanize the accused, to offer an explanation, no matter how dark, for the brutality of his acts, to suggest that it was not pure evil driving him, but a sick mind. Perhaps if mental incapacity could be proven, the death penalty might be avoided. But the defense's hopes crumbled before the expert evaluations. The medical and psychological assessments were clear and did not support the theory of a serious mental disorder. There was no clinical evidence of schizophrenia, that fracture with reality that often exempts from responsibility. Nor was there a diagnosis of bipolar disorder, which would explain extreme mood and behavior shifts. What the experts found, what the analyses revealed, was far more desolate. Not an incapacitating mental illness, but the harsh reality of a young man with a history of violence, abandonment, and frustration. It was a life story marked by neglect, by a lack of opportunity, by a path that seemed to have pushed him inexorably toward the abyss. It wasn't madness, but the product of a broken existence, of emotional wounds that never healed and that, perhaps, had transformed him into someone insensitive to the suffering of others. This revelation didn't justify his actions, but it did add a layer of complexity to the profile of the accused, raising the uncomfortable question of how much the environment influences the making of a criminal. Is a monster born, or is one created through the failures of the system and society? The scales of justice tipped inexorably toward conviction. The Gudinas case is a clear example of how mental health defenses can fail when there is no solid clinical diagnosis. His lack of empathy was seen not as a symptom, but as a trait of his antisocial personality. After 3 weeks, the verdict was unanimous: guilty, and the sentence, death penalty. Following the conviction, Thomas Lee Gudinas' fate was sealed with the cold steel and concrete of death row. He was sent to Florida State Prison in Starker, a name that echoes with a dark reputation. This maximum security prison is not just a place of confinement. It is an institution known for its extremely strict security measures, an unbreakable fortress, and, more somberly, as the frequent site of executions in the state of Florida. Entering there is to cross a threshold from which few ever return. His new reality, the cell, was nothing more than a cage of despair. It measured just over 2 by 3 meters, a claustrophobic space that would become his universe for nearly 3 decades. Inside, the austerity was brutal. A concrete bed, cold and unforgiving, designed for punishment, not rest. A steel toilet, utilitarian and impersonal. And a simple slit in the door, the only contact with the outside world, through which meals were served, a constant reminder of his total dependence and confinement. Each day, each night, the same view, the same solitude, the same imprisonment. How does a human being endure that monotony, that annulment of individuality? For nearly 3 decades, Gudinas waited. Waiting on death row is not mere passage of time. It is a psychological purgatory, a prolonged agony in which every tick of the clock brings the prisoner closer to the end. During that time, his life became a constant legal battle, a race against the clock of execution. He appealed again and again, exhausting every resource, clinging to any glimmer of hope the labyrinthine judicial system could offer. His lawyers fought tirelessly, reviewing every document, every testimony, searching for an error, a new piece of evidence, anything that could stop the wheels of justice. In his desperation, he sent letters. To whom? Judges, human rights organizations, relatives, perhaps people he no longer remembered or who had already forgotten him. Each letter was a silent scream from the darkness, an attempt to be heard, to break through the isolation. In those letters and interrogations, his narrative at times oscillated. He denied certain things, perhaps in a last attempt to cling to some version of innocence or to lessen the burden of guilt. But in other moments, surprisingly or strategically, he confessed others, revealing fragments of truth that only he knew, keeping his audience and the system itself in a state of constant uncertainty. Was it a game of manipulation or an inner struggle for truth? The fundamental question about his remorse always hung in the air. Did he truly regret his actions, or only their consequences? At a review hearing in 2005, a decade after his conviction, a judge, with the coldness that experience brings, asked him the direct question that torments victims and society. Do you feel remorse? Gudinas' answer to that question, or his lack of one, would seal not only his public image, but perhaps, in the final balance, his fate. His response was dry, almost disconnected from reality. Things didn't turn out the way I thought they would. Not a word about Michelle, not a word of forgiveness. During that time, defense attorneys tried to argue ineffective counsel in the original trial, procedural errors, and even an appeal regarding the method of execution, lethal injection versus electric chair. None of it prevailed. Florida gradually hardened its death penalty policy. Governor Ron DeSantis signed multiple execution orders in 2025, among them that of Gudinas. The calendar, relentless, has marked the final date. On June 24, 2025, the life of Thomas Lee Gudinas will come to an end at Florida State Prison. Lethal injection, a method of execution designed to be humane, though it hides a clinical coldness, will be the instrument of his final breath. Just a few days before the summer solstice, the life of a man will be extinguished forever, adding another name to the grim list of executions. His death will not be an isolated event. With it, Gudinas will become the 7th person executed that year in the state of Florida, a statistic that, for death penalty advocates, signals justice fulfilled, a law applied with resolve. For its detractors, It is a grim reminder of the death machine's relentlessness, of the fragility of life in the hands of the state. 7 lives in less than 6 months, a pace that underlines Florida's determination to apply the ultimate penalty. What stories hide behind each of those names, beyond the headline? In his final hours, Gudinas will be offered the last rites that the system grants the condemned. He will have the right to a final meal, a paradoxical gesture of humanity at the threshold of total dehumanization. What will he choose? A dish that brings back a childhood memory, a last connection to a world he is about to leave, or something meaningless, one more sign of his indifference or resignation. The choice of that final bite is, for many, a mystery, a fleeting window into the psyche of a man on the brink of the abyss. And if he wishes, he will have the opportunity to say final words. A microphone will await, ready to capture any statement, any regret, any challenge. It's a moment that could define his legacy, a final opportunity for remorse, for truth, or for silence. Will he break his enigmatic silence from that 1996 interrogation? Or will he choose to take his secrets to the grave? For those following the case, the anticipation will be palpable. But up to the time of this narration, Gudinas' silence persists, unbroken and disturbing. He has not requested family visits, a fact that speaks volumes about possible ruptures in his life, or perhaps about his desire to face the end alone. Is there truly no one in his life who would visit him? Or is he the one refusing to be seen in his final hours? A choice to preserve some form of dignity or to protect others from the pain of farewell. And the most heartbreaking detail for the victims' families, for a society seeking closure. He has not expressed any public remorse either. That crucial question from the judge in 2005, "Do you feel remorse?" seems to have remained without a definitive public answer, at least not one that satisfies those who long for a sign of contrition. His silence is not merely the absence of words. It is the absence of a mea culpa, an unbridgeable barrier that leaves many with the feeling that true understanding, true emotional closure, will never come. On June 24th, the curtain will fall. But the story of Thomas Lee Gudinas will not end with his death. His case, like so many others on death row, will continue to raise uncomfortable questions about justice, retribution, and the possibility of redemption. Gudinas' final silence will echo long after his pulse has stopped, a somber reminder of the depths of the human soul and the complexities of a system that, at times, leaves more questions than answers. This kind of behavior is typical in individuals with severe antisocial profiles. The absence of empathy, emotional coldness, and resistance to acknowledging harm are deep psychological barriers. Gudinas doesn't appear remorseful. He appears resigned. The procedure will be standardized: transfer to the execution area, placement of IV catheters, medical observation, official reading of name and sentence, and administration of the lethal drugs. Michelle McGrath was not just a victim. She was a daughter, a friend, a student. She liked pop music, 90s movies, and drinking coffee with her mother on Sundays. Her friends remembered her as someone who always made you feel seen. Her family has lived 30 years without her. 30 Christmases, 30 empty birthdays. The murder didn't just end her life. It altered the lives of everyone who loved her. Justice arrives late. Reparation, never. Because no execution can bring back what was lost that May morning. The case of Thomas Lee Gudinas revives the eternal debate. Is the death penalty justice or revenge? Florida has intensified executions, but each case is a mirror. Does executing a man 3 decades after the crime serve any purpose beyond closing a file? What changes? What is repaired? The execution of Gudinas is legal, but it raises an ethical question. Are we punishing the man he was in 1994, or the one he is today? And what do we gain from that? The pain doesn't disappear. The crime doesn't either. According to data from the Death Penalty Information Center, the number of condemned inmates executed after more than 25 years on death row is increasing. Justice comes, but it comes old. Orlando, 3:10 a.m., May 1994. Michelle walks quickly to her car. She hears footsteps behind her. She turns. A man approaches. She doesn't scream. She hesitates. He pulls out something shiny. It's a flashlight. And in seconds, everything turns to darkness. Silence. Death. Thomas Lee Gudinas will die at 51. Michelle died at 22. He had 30 more years of life. She, only one more night. Justice may be blind, but memory is not. Memory remembers what was lost, what failed, what should never have happened. And it remembers that behind every execution, there is a story that began long before the crime.